God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world, we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love.
Do you remember the early days of your dating? Maybe the first experiences of romance in your life? I remember them very well. I was painfully shy as a young lad. I would easily fall in love, but then I would never tell anyone about it. I would keep it to myself, just assuming that the other person would want nothing to do with me. That all changed when, age 14, I met a girl called Luz Dari Sanchez, and my heart melted for this girl. And it was the first time something was reciprocated back the other way. I found out through friends that she liked me, and we had a date or two. It didn't last very long. But in those dates, what I remember was such an emotional roller coaster. When we were close together, when we were holding hands, walking down the street, when we were kissing, in those closer, intimate moments, my confidence in that love was sky high. My confidence in her love for me was through the roof. And it was confidence because I could see it, I could feel it, and I had to wipe it off my face. And I'm sure she did too with me. I was a very good kisser then. But what was very interesting was that when she went back home and I went back home, doubt crept in. The confidence dropped rapidly. Fear crept in. Fear that she didn't like me. Fear that there was someone else at school that was way better looking than I, much funnier than I, more charismatic than I, that she would fall in love with very soon. It's so interesting, Ian. I wonder if your experience was the same. Such confidence when there's closeness and intimacy and connection, but such lack of confidence, even fear, when there's the disconnect physically. This was a torment for me as a young lad, and hence why I was hopelessly rubbish at dating. But I wonder if this is how you might relate to God. When you feel close and connected, you are confident in the Father's love for you. But when you're distant, when you feel like you're maybe not hearing from God, or maybe that you don't know God that well yet, your confidence is low. Maybe you're even fearful. And in many ways, that's what's going on in our passage today. John, who writes this letter, is urging you and I to be confident before God. He says this, he says, we will have confidence on the day of judgment. Whenever that may be, whatever that might look like, John is reminding you and I that we are to stand confidently before God, cheerfully convinced of the Father's love for us. Not because we're perfect, not because we've attained perfection in God's eyes, but because he says that in this world, we are like Christ. One caveat here, not that we are like Christ in his deeds, in his actions, in our thoughts, not even in our character, but simply that we stand shoulder to shoulder with Christ before God. His confidence before God becomes our confidence before God. John would like nothing more than for his letter to inspire and to produce a generation of Christians who is utterly confident before God. And to suggest, or for John to suggest, that we can be like this with God, confident in front of him, says something enormous about the nature of God. It says something about who God is, that we can relate to him like this. God is love, he says. For you and I to come before God as we are, in whatever state that may be, and to say that we can be confident and have confidence tells us something of who John thinks God is and who we should think God is too. God ain't to be feared, but instead he's simply to be received. He's not a God who condemns, but who welcomes. He's not a God who scorns, but instead he nurtures. As the story of the prodigal son tells us, he's the sort of God that when we are far off, he runs to us. Colin Gunton says that the offer of salvation, the offer of God's love for our lives is completely, unutterly universal. But the take-up, the acceptance of that offer is not universal. In Romans 8, verse 38, Paul writes this. He says, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels or demons, neither present nor the future, nor any power, neither height or depth, or anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus." Nothing can separate you and I from the love of God. Apart from, that is, yourself or ourselves. The enemy is highly skilled at convincing us that God does not love us. And unfortunately, you and I are also highly skilled at creating an image of God who is angry, who is wrathful, vengeful, who demands perfection from his subjects, who will crush us if we step out of line, who will control and shape us through fear of him. We could not, and we damn well would not, stand confident before a God like that. And that is because that is not God. And if that is your perception of God, then today is the day that you begin to change that perception. God is love. And John is urging us that we don't just think that or know that intellectually. He's urging us that we live like that is a truth in our lives, that it's something we can draw from. We're not to be fearful of God. There is no fear in love. Fear and love are completely incompatible. It's like oil and water. They can't occupy the same space. They repel one another. And neither can we approach God in one moment in love, but then hide from him in fear in the next. The two are incompatible. And fear is all about punishment. To define fear says this: to fear is to suffer or experience the punishment before it has even arrived. And God has no punishment for you or for I set aside for a rainy day, or for the day of judgment, or for right now, when we stand shoulder to shoulder with Jesus in our lives. Punishment is alien to love, and therefore punishment is alien to God. It cannot exist in God's presence. Our great character as Christians is not that we fear or that we are shaped through our fears. Our character as Christians is that we love and that we are loved. Love that is confident casts out our fears. Secondly, John goes on in his letter. He says this. He says, perfect love casts out fear. And I don't know about you, but when I read that passage or when I hear it, I put the onus on me to achieve flawless or perfect love. It is my responsibility to love perfectly, and then my fears might be cast out. But that's not what John means by this. The Greek is the word telia. It doesn't mean perfect. It translates more like completion or to complete or to accomplish. John is talking not about flawless love. He's talking about complete love. Complete love casts out fear. A journey can be completed, even if that journey was flawless. A calling, your calling and my calling, can be accomplished, even if the one who is called is flawless. In other words, you and I play a part in a circuit of love. And we help complete that circuit. We play our part in casting out our fear and the fear of others. We don't attain perfect love. We simply complete perfect love. This makes perfect love less about us, or almost nothing to do with us, and all about the one who gives love, the one who is love, and how we receive that love, and then how we pass that love on. Complete love is the love of God expressing itself in our love to others. In other words, we're like a bit of conduit. We're like a tool, if you like, for God. On one end of the conduit or the pipe, we are fully confident before God that we are loved and we can receive that love. That's what comes into us. And at the other end of the conduit, that love that we receive from God is fully expressed in how we love others, in how that love comes out the other end of that pipe. I prefer the analogy of like an electrical circuit. Do you remember those from school where you would complete a circuit, you'd press the button and the light would come on? We are a bit of that circuit. And if it's all connected, when that button is pressed, the light comes on. And you and I complete that circuit of love for God. But if any part of that circuit is missing, the light won't come on. And a relationship with Jesus places you and I in that circuit. And as part of that circuit, we help that light shine brightly. It shines on the darkness in our lives. It shines on the darkness in others' lives too. And it casts out fear. You know, the world is a tough place, isn't it, at times? Fear is thrown at us from every direction. There's money fears. There's shelter fears about keeping a roof above our heads. There's fitting in. There's being accepted. There's career fears. There's relationship fears when we struggle in our relationships. There's materialistic fears when we don't have the things that others do. There's fears about our status in who we are and where we fit in society. There's disease, there's sickness, there's pandemics. And a relationship with Jesus can begin to alleviate that kind of fear, that kind of worldly fear. But it is confident love, confidence before God, casts out our worldly fears. But to add to this, as Christians, we also have a calling from Jesus. To follow Jesus places us in situations and places of fear that attack the very, very inner thoughts of who we are. In many ways, it can feel like we're swimming against the tide, that we're countercultural. The Jesus lifestyle is a radical lifestyle, and we are called to it. And it calls us to do some pretty fearful things. It calls us to forgive others, even if those who we need to forgive have done something terrible to us. We are called to forgive. We're called to submit and sacrifice our lives to our partners. We are called to outrageous generosity, even when we have very little. We're called to be the least among our friends, among our families, and among our colleagues. We're called to live simply. We are called to be patient with the unbearable people in our lives. We're called to admit and own our faults. We're called to be living sacrifices for the will of God. These are huge claims. You can't take these with a pinch of salt. This ain't easy. And if we're not careful, this calling can generate so much fear in our lives as well. There are implications to our inner lives, to our inner thoughts and emotions when we choose to follow Jesus. But there is a sense in this letter that John writes that these things we are called to do. And it's part of this circuit of love. We don't do these things out of obligation. And if you are doing things for others out of obligation, I want you to stop doing them right now, because we do them out of love. We always serve. We act out our calling in love. Complete love casts out this kind of fear. And in many ways, this passage is a little bit like a kind of spiritual health check that John is writing. If there is fear in your life right now, Perhaps there's a part of the circuit which has become disconnected. And this letter should challenge us if we are experiencing fear in our lives right now. It challenges us in two ways. It challenges our confidence before God, the love that comes in. It asks us two questions. It's asking you, what is your view of God? Is it big enough? Or is your perception and your understanding of God too small or completely wrong that you cannot have confidence in front of him? The second question it asks is, has your devotion of God been replaced by something else? Is something between you and God in your life right now? And both of those can increase fear in your lives. A too small a perception of God, devoting your life to something else other than God, will increase fear in your life. Secondly, it challenges the love that comes out of us. It's about the complete love to others. Again, the two questions it asks are we a conduit for God's love to others? Or is there a block in the pipe? Are we keeping the love for ourselves and not passing it on to others? Or are we simply not receiving? Is there nothing coming in that we can pass on to others? And are we serving people purely out of obligation because we think as Christians that's what we've got to do, and we are working hard at it and we are sweating at it, but secretly in our hearts we are cursing, we are angry, we're burnt out, and we're fearful? We know when we block the flow of God's love. We find others intolerable, irritable, and even hatred is bubbling up in us about others in our lives. And this letter is a great letter to take stock and find out why that is. Both ends of the circuit are equally important. When Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment? He said, love your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all of your soul, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And in this letter, in this passage today, John is stitching those two commandments together as one commandment. They cannot be separated. Do both is what Jesus is saying. They are two sides of the same coin. You cannot receive the love of God and not pass it through. And you cannot pass through love to others if there ain't nothing coming in. In either of those situations, fear could well be in your life. And fear is a sign that there's something wrong in the circuit and we need to take action. We love because he first loved us is the very next line in John's letter after our passage that we have read today. Complete love defeats your fear. Confident love, confidence before God defeats your fear. Amen.